That shame then comes from ourselves, that we might say to ourselves, how can it be that I did not perform? It can come from others. Is it that you can't speak Spanish? I thought you were no era Latino. Or what happens to a lot of us when we're talking to other Latinos, que te responden en inglés. They respond to you in English, and it's one of those things where you're like, I failed. And then cue the shame of, I did not perform the way that I wanted to, so they had to default to English in order to accommodate my limited language presentation. And this essentially translates into a feeling of not being Latino enough, Spanish speaking enough, blank enough. This is why I say oftentimes language and identity are so intertwined, because if our culture and our community speaks a language other than whatever we are dominant in or practice in, then we have a lot of this back and forth between trying the language, fearing the language, feeling shame about the language. And then the last bit is when you feel that shame, that does not feel good. And so what happens to a lot of people is that they go into the last step of the cycle, avoidance. Many people say, I wish that I would have just learned Spanish when I was younger. And today we are going to talk about why is it that many of us didn't want to learn or practice our Spanish when we were younger within our households. I am Dr. Xiomara Rivera Pagan. I am the founder of LUPA Talks, and in these weekly sessions we talk about how language is learned, how language is used, and how we can reclaim our language in order to connect with our community, our family, and our culture. If you like what you hear today, make sure to subscribe, share with other people in your life, and stay until the end, because all of these sessions, I always start with some sort of challenge, some sort of issue that we have been working through or continue to work through, but I always, Mrs. Brightside, give you a way to move forward. In the last video, I spoke about elder generations and the challenges that they have in passing down a language. So it might be our parents, it might be our grandparents, but over time, especially when you are growing up outside of your home language and culture, it becomes increasingly challenging for many reasons. Watch the previous video to get a list of them, and then also how to work through that. And in that one, I focus specifically on how others are transferring the language to us, how others are passing down the heritage language, how others are encouraging us to practice the language, but certain challenges that they might have had. Now I shift the focus to us. In today's session, I want to focus on the fact that we are part of the equation. We are a reason why we may or may not have a certain proficiency in terms of our language. And so there are some of us who might have grown up in households where our families were trying to support us, that they did have the resources, that there was the community, that there was a lot of the barriers to entry that I mentioned in the last video, but in your particular household, it was actually possible. You were trying to practice it. Your elders were trying to show you the language. And still, you might have had a challenging time picking up the language. And today, we're going to focus on how you might have contributed to the challenge, because a lot of times we focus on others, and we have to acknowledge that to some extent, we also have to own the decisions that we made. At least to a certain point. When we are younger, obviously, we are influenced by a lot of outside factors. We'll talk about some of those outside factors today. And there are some elements that are within our control. And so once we decide that we want to return to our language, learn our language, reclaim our language, we can do it if we decide that we no longer want to be a barrier for ourselves. So I find that there is a bit of a cycle in terms of why we, heritage speakers, don't necessarily feel comfortable practicing our language. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of what that visual looks like for me when I see it play out, and then how we can work through it. So the first part of the cycle is limited input or limited opportunities for production. So there's a limited either opportunity for you to listen in terms of feeling confident enough. I understand, I comprehend, I have enough of what I need in order to feel confident to then try to practice it. And or there's limited spaces where you can practice it. And so it creates part two, fear, anxiety, that then goes into shame, when we don't perform in the way that we want to, that then makes us avoidant, so that we continue the cycle into limited input or limited production opportunities, into fear, into shame, into avoidance, and so on and so forth. So depending on what your experiences have been, you might find that you wanted at one point throughout your youth to practice the language. You wanted, or you even thought you were practicing the language, but you had some experiences that made you feel uncomfortable or insecure or embarrassed, and then it becomes harder to then take those risks the more that you either avoid or the more that you have those negative experiences. So let's talk about step number one, or the first part of the cycle. Is this limited input or limited opportunities for production? Similar to the last video where I was talking about when we are outside of our home language and culture, there needs to be a lot of intentionality about where to practice and how to practice it. And in terms of just the abundance of language surrounding you, consciously and subconsciously, it's very different from when you're growing up in a home language and culture. So in my example, if I would have grown up en Puerto Rico, entonces I'm going to el supermercado en el español puertorriqueño. I'm hanging out at the park, el español puertorriqueño. And so whether I'm trying to practice or not, I am surrounded by it, and I have a lot of not only opportunities to practice speaking, but what is often not addressed enough is to practice listening passively. So think about whenever you go out into public, you overhear all sorts of conversations, and to some extent your brain is passively thinking, I hear that, I understand that, what is that about? Curiosity, in a way that when you are growing up outside of your home language and culture, so in my example again, instead of being in Puerto Rico, in Florida, in Massachusetts, in Maryland, then that passive input that is coming in is no longer en el español puertorriqueño, it's instead in English. Different varieties of English, especially if you're thinking about Florida to Maryland to Massachusetts, those are very different. But the reality is that there's English all around, so that passive input that then makes me feel more confident in terms of when I hear that being spoken, having practiced listening to it intentionally as well as subconsciously, it supports the idea of fear coming down. And we'll talk about fear in a second, but it's really important to acknowledge the fact that all of that input is part of what makes us feel more confident, more comfortable, and more proficient. And then the other side of the coin is more opportunities for practice, because I have to, because I'm in the grocery store, or because I'm at school, or because I go to the park. In order to engage with society, you need to practice language. And when you are in an English dominant society, the default to some extent in many spaces, unless you are in one of those beautiful pockets throughout the United States that are prevalent, but I was not in, that practice languages other than English, then you default to whatever the dominant language. For me, it was English. And so the first part of it that we need to acknowledge is if we have limited input and we have limited practice with producing, that is then not building up not our proficiency and not our confidence, so that when we get to step number two, which is usually someone in our family or our community trying to encourage us to learn the language. So often what happens is our family members or our community members say, vamos a practicar el español, o vamos a hablar español. And because they want to support you in practicing the language, they say, let's make the time. They make the time for it. But if you don't have that input and production practice, then just making the time can be a fear or an anxiety-inducing experience. Fear is not just a feeling. It is a feeling that induces reaction within our body and our brain that then has consequences in terms of how our brain functions. And so when we are nervous, when we are anxious, then your body releases a stress hormone that is called cortisol. And that cortisol affects your prefrontal cortex that's responsible for planning speech, organizing sentences, and working memory. And when cortisol rises, activity in this area decreases, which results in harder to find words, harder to form sentences, and harder to speak fluently. We can think about, for example, when we are told that we need to speak in front of an audience, or that we need to make a speech, or we need to do a formal address, or a presentation in front of your class. Any of those are going to then make you feel uncomfortable, and even though you have been practicing, you might feel like you don't have the words to express what you have been practicing, and you know the language. So where did the language go? And a lot of us experience that, and we don't understand why it was that we knew it before and then we're out of those tense situations and we know it after. Somebody asks us a question, we're like, and then you leave that scenario and you're like, I know exactly how to answer that. It is because your body is reacting to that anxiety by putting you in a state that hopefully helps us to survive in other instances, because our body is thinking that we're getting chased by a tiger. We're not getting chased by a tiger, but it does feel like that when we are anxious in scenarios that question our identity especially. Another part of the brain that the cortisol affects is the hippocampus, responsible for memory retrieval and vocabulary recall. High cortisol can cause tip of the tongue moments, forgetting words that you already know, slower language retrieval. The key message is that it is not a problem of intelligence when you can't speak in the way that you want to. It's not even necessarily a problem of language in many cases. Not every case, but in many cases, a lot of us has experienced, I know this, I don't know why it is that when I'm in front of people, I can't speak the way that I want to speak. This has a lot to do with it. And then going back to, if we didn't have structured, safe, scaffolded experiences, and we were just told, this is when we can practice, boom, well, it's gonna feel even more unsafe, insecure, which is going to increase all of this. So this is important to keep in mind, because in the past, we might have experienced this. That leads to then step 3, which is, I did not perform the way that I wanted to perform. I'm so embarrassed. I cannot believe that I forgot a word or a phrase, or that I didn't answer in the way that I've been preparing to answer. And that makes you feel shameful. And that shame then comes from ourselves, that we might say to ourselves, how can it be that I did not perform? It can come from others. Is it that you can't speak Spanish? I thought you were, tú no eres Latino. Or what happens to a lot of us when we're talking to other Latino, que te responden en inglés. They respond to you in English, and it's one of those things where you're like, I failed. And then cue the shame of, I did not perform the way that I wanted to, so they had to default to English in order to accommodate my limited language my limited language presentation. And this essentially translates into a feeling of not being Latino enough, Spanish speaking enough, blank enough. This is why I say oftentimes language and identity are so intertwined, because if our culture and our community speaks a language other than whatever we are dominant in or practice in, then we have a lot of this back and forth between trying the language, fearing the language, feeling shame about the language, and then the last bit is when you feel that shame, that does not feel good. And so what happens to a lot of people is that they go into the last step of the cycle, avoidance, where they say to themselves, that did not feel good, I'm not doing that again. And they might limit the spaces that they practice the language in, the people that they practice the language with, or something else. But the point is that language then becomes limited because they felt this fear, this shame, so they avoid, which means back in the cycle, limited input, limited production to fear, shame, avoid. So, good news, we can break the cycle. Like I said, there's always solutions. Step number 1, and I'll give you 3 because I love a good 3-step solution. Step number 1 is to increase the input. And that can come in many forms. So it could come from listening more, because that's the safest, right? And I highly recommend listening more, because technically reading is also great input, But I recommend listening because you are practicing the skill that you are most commonly going to face when you are outside engaging with other individuals in terms of speaking and listening, interpersonal communication, right? And so if you are practicing reading, that is great, and that is a part of what is going to support your overall vocabulary building, proficiency building, so on and so forth. But I highly recommend listening being a core area that you are practicing, because then that is going to help you start feeling more confident about receiving language. Once you feel like you can receive that language, you can feel a little bit more safe to then produce that language. And then you can go on to steps 2 and 3. Step 2, find safe spaces. Ideally with individuals with similar language goals. And so if you are increasing your input and you decide to yourself, now I am ready to practice the language, then ideally you go into spaces that are structured in a way that are either pedagogically aligned with your goals or emotionally aligned with your goals, ideally both. And so ideally we look for spaces where we can share what our language insecurities and our language goals are in order to create a plan, so that we can say to ourselves, what is the first step in order to feel safe, but also pushing myself to do something new. And I really like spaces that are a variety of proficiency levels, because that is what is most similar to the real world. And in the real world, you are not going to go into the restaurant line that is specifically for novice learners. You're not going to go into a store and buy some pants from the intermediate speaker. In those spaces where you have a diverse range of abilities, you get to practice both sides of the spectrum. You get to practice teaching other people and finding out that, wow, I have a stronger ability than I realized, and I can share my confidence with someone else. I can teach someone else. By teaching, we learn. And if you are with somebody who is more advanced than you, then you are obviously going to learn, because you can have more input that can help build your vocabulary. You can learn from them. And so it's this reciprocal learning environment that is really helpful in terms of recognizing that spaces can be safe, even if we have people who are more advanced or less advanced than us. Because sometimes we find that the only spaces that are safe are the spaces that we're leading and saying, this is my ability, so don't push or don't pull. Sometimes you're gonna have to be in a space where you're going to have to share more about your background and your language identity and how that's complicated and messy, and that's okay. That's actually a beautiful thing. So step 1, increase the input. Step 2, find safe spaces. And step 3, incremental goals. And so I mentioned this a little bit earlier in terms of having that seesaw of wanting to make sure that you are challenged enough so that you don't get bored, but not so challenged that you get frustrated. And so if you create incremental goals that you can work towards, ideally with the support of somebody who has background in terms of pedagogy and an understanding of language learning, then you can work towards those goals in a way that makes you feel not only safe, but also like you're making progress. Everybody wants to feel like they are not only working hard, but also that all of that hard work is translating into successes, achievements. Especially with everything that's going on right now, anything additional ideally is grounded in something that makes us feel better, even better if it makes us feel joyful. So again, we have a quick summary of the cycle that you might have experienced that might have led to you not feeling like you wanted to practice, and that is okay. We can recognize it now is limited input and or limited production opportunities, which led to fear or anxiety about the language, which led to maybe not performing the way that you wanted to, so shame and embarrassment, which led to avoidance in terms of practicing the language, which led to limited input and production opportunities. But what can we do about it? We can increase the input, find safe spaces, and work towards incremental goals. So hopefully that is helpful for you. Let me know if you have any other suggestions that you want to give, or if you have any other reasons why maybe you might have been hesitant to practice and use your language with your family. LUPA Talks Reco de la Semana is Mother Tongue Tied. Este libro me fascina, me encanta. I will link it in the captions. It is in English, and it's actually about the author is Polish Canadian, lives in the UK, and is raising her family, or they are practicing multilingualism within her household. It's written in English, but I think it's really helpful in terms of, number one, understanding more about the complexity of having multiple languages in your home and having to decide how to navigate them, what choices your families had to make, what choices you guys as a nucleus have to make. I have found this book really helpful in terms of understanding more about language, and it's the most accessible. I have, obviously for my doctorate, I had to read many books, a lot heftier, and I can recommend some of those, but this is a very accessible book in terms of explaining some of those dynamics in terms of multilingualism, research, best practices, and then also the feelings that come up in terms of excitement, embarrassment, shame, frustration, so on and so forth. So, Mother Tongue Tied, I will link it in the captions. And then always giving you ways to practice. With LUPA Talks, you are more than welcome, and I would love to see you in a Spanglish session where you can actually practice that input, the production in a Spanglish friendly environment. I say Spanglish friendly because I always say if Spanish is here and English is here, then everything technically in between is Spanglish. And so what we're trying to do is move the needle from less to more of our target language. So if I'm trying to work on more Spanish, it's not that I have to go from 0 to Spanish in one day. I can use Spanglish as a tool to push myself a little further. So I'm saying more and more in Spanish, but also feeling safe enough that I can express myself, because sometimes, especially as adults, we feel frustrated. We also have the WhatsApp community where we share daily challenges, we share resources, and we share a supportive community. And so I'll link that in the bio as well. Y entonces tenemos Dímelo speaking cards. This is just a fun game that I created in order to support the language practice with your family and friends in a way that feels approachable, enjoyable. So they are bilingual speaking cards in Spanish and English that practice questions on getting to know you, ponte personal cards, as well as Dilo como tú quieras, that actually a chunk of the cards focus on how we use memories of language, ways that our families have used language, in order for us to think about that, because there's not a lot of opportunities to talk about that sort of language and identity, and that I think is really important in terms of reclaiming your language. And so if any of this resonated with you, I would love it if you would comment, share, participate in this community. And remember, this space is to reclaim your language. And so dilo como tú quieras, connect with your community y hazlo con LUPA Talks. Nos vemos, hasta la próxima.